fraud rang out from this group against the prophet. In fact, all of the long-term Masons among them acted in just the opposite manner. So my question is, why do Latter-day Saints, such as Matt Brown and all, try to diminish Freemasonry and its influence in order to try to give validity to the Mormon endowment? The Mormon endowment has its own validity through revelation. You don't have to minimize Freemasonry, simply recognize this is part of the process through inspiration that Joseph Smith returned the endowment to the earth. It's fascinating how on one hand he tries to brush away all the influences of Freemasonry, and on the other hand he has no choice. The evidence shows he has to show there was influence. He's arguing against the critics who say Joseph Smith was a thief. He had no revelation whatsoever. He simply got all of his inspiration from Freemasonry. And the critics are simply wrong on their take too. In that respect, Matt Brown's book is okay to show the timeline. Unfortunately, his desire to refute the critics, I don't think he gives the proper relationship between Mormonism and Freemasonry. I think another serious problematic error in Brown on page 127, on page 128, Joseph Smith's intent was to restore Freemasonry to its pure form. This is one of the themes that arises periodically. There are no statements, first-hand, second-hand, or otherwise, by the prophet Joseph Smith indicating that the Nauvoo-era temple ordinances were a form of purified masonry. While it is true that in some instances individual saints referred to the most sacred rituals of their religion as a type of celestial, divine, or true masonry, it should be noted that this practice seems to have begun 14 years after Joseph Smith's death, and it was instigated by Heber C. Kimball. Starting to get a lot of traffic on this road. The fact that several Masonic but Mormon-dominated lodges functioned in the vicinity of Nauvoo at the very same time that temple ordinances were being given forcefully illustrates that the Mormon ordinances were in no way equated with the Masonic rites. Becoming a Mason did not give a person the status of being endowed, in other words. If just because you're a Mason does not mean you have the endowment now. So he makes a good point there. His rites, he says, furthermore, if Joseph Smith had really intended to restore ancient York Masonry to its pristine state and introduce that untainted version among the Mormons, then his rites should exhibit a pronounced affinity with the stonemason rites of old, yet this is not how things stand. Latter-day Saints who are endowed have absolutely no connection to architects, building laborers, or the science of geometry. Then how did they build their temples? I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. Now, he's talking the medieval stone rites, but you didn't build a temple without architecture, geometry, and being stonemasons. And that's precisely how they built the Kirtland Temple and the Nauvoo Temple, was using those same principles. I disagree with that completely. I understand why Brown is making the argument. I just don't think it's that effective. The nature of the Nauvoo Temple ordinances was plainly spelled out by the Lord before they were introduced among the saints and before Joseph Smith was received into the Masonic fraternity. That's his assumption. I don't know if they were plainly understood totally, because it was a line-by-line process throughout the course of about 15 years. He's trying to minimize the influence of Freemasonry in the Nauvoo Temple endowment. And I'm not sure. I don't think that's the way it is. And then he says there would be a Hebrew basis to the Mason characters if it was a restoration of rituals once practiced in the tabernacle constructed by Moses and the temple constructed by King Solomon. I've got news for you. The Hebrew elements are in Freemasonry. One has to know about the Hebrew constructs and information, which I do somewhat. They're there. Brown wouldn't know that because he's not a Mason, but I know that because I am a Mason. So that's problematic as well. And then he says, the Kirtland Temple rituals were a precursor of the Nauvoo Temple rituals. That's correct. The Kirtland washing and anointing ceremonies predated Joseph Smith's Masonic membership, which is irrelevant because that's not part of the Freemasonry that Joseph Smith incorporated. See, he's doing a sleight of hand. He's trying to show you all the differences, and then he's saying the similarities are not that big a deal. In some respects, he's correct. The similarities between the Freemason and the Mormon endowment is not that big a deal, but it's there. It wasn't stole whole cloth, but it's there. That's my point. You don't have to minimize Freemasonry in order to elevate Mormonism. Just accept Freemasonry as being there and being a part of it, because that's what the historical record shows. This doesn't damage the temple endowment, though. So that's interesting. He says, the saints themselves, they take the initiation rites back to the experience by the priests of ancient Israel. So does Freemasonry. Matt Brown won't know that, but I do. So that's not a good contrast, in my opinion. I think another aspect of Brown's problematic understanding of all of this is found on page 132, where he says, from all the above sources it can be seen that the prophet and the saints who knew him did not hold to the view that the process of temple restoration was based upon one man's inner sense of inspiration. Instead, they taught that the temple ordinances were restored at the behest of the Lord through his duly authorized heavenly representatives and through the power of divine revelation. I think it's a mix. Brown is trying to separate the process of exterior revelation from interior inspiration. But even Joseph Smith said inspiration is an aspect of revelation. And I believe he was inspired once he became a Freemason to see the vehicle of Freemasonry as a very serious potential way to get the message of the endowment across. I think that's really, I don't think that's a strong argument by Brown at all, in my opinion. And finally, on page 156, Brown, after surveying the evidence of the Freemasonic influences and connections to the early Mormon brethren and in the Nauvoo era, he finally says, well, Elder Richards, he's quoting Franklin D. Richards. He says, Joseph Smith was aware that there were some things about Masonry which had come down from the beginning, and he desired to know what they were. Hence the lodge was established at Nauvoo. So, see, there's the influence right there. Joseph knew about Freemasonry. And I think that admission is important, because the endowment did not come in a vacuum. It came through revelation, even while Joseph was on the earth. And the idea that if Joseph had environmental influences, then that damages the theme that he had revelation, I think that's a faulty assumption. I believe that's the assumption Matt Brown labors under too difficultly. I know Dan Vogel, in his book, Joseph Smith, The Making of a Mormon Prophet, he just goes straight environmental influence. And I think that's part of the reason the LDS scholars are reacting the way they are. Dan Vogel believes there was no revelation, so Matt Brown is responding to that attitude by saying it's all revelation and no environmental influence. And I think it's a mix. I think it's full revelation with the information and influences that Joseph Smith had surrounding him. That does not damage the fact that it's revealed. That's my take on